Hey guys, it's Ken. This week I finally cleared my schedule to try out a few demos from the Steam Next Fest. I had planned to try 10, but the second one I launched took me for so long that the other 8 are still waiting. And plotting. I love indie games, and I find that they're not only a great way to have some quick fun, but also to identify very clear game design decisions, and the developers are usually much more open to feedback than many larger studios. So welcome to the first episode of Fed Back, where I chew up indie games and feed them right back to you. Today's game is Siegecaster, a unique siege defense game that reminds me of Age of Empires, where I would line my walled city with sentry towers to hold off an Axeman Zerg rush while I'm just desperately trying to build a pretty little town. Made by Half Human Games, whose previous game Dwerve also blends tower defense with active combat, and you can buy it immediately. The focus of Siegecaster is to expand your control of the map so that you can gather runes for upgrades, fit in more turrets, keep your core safe, and convert the harsh wilderness into pure stone. The story goal is to complete all 12 levels, each of which rewards a rune shard. I'm not going to delve into the story past that, but overall it's a neat idea, and I'm excited to see how it ends. You start with a garrison, and that's your core. You build walls, which are given to you in a random order of various Tetris shapes and have to encapsulate a garrison or rune to control it, forcing your control zone to grow, but also making enemies start attacking your control zone sooner. Nice trade-off. Inside your control zone, you place towers, also called turrets, but I'm an old dog and I'm sticking with towers. The goal is to survive all the waves of increasingly stronger enemies to secure the rune shard at the very end. You have 4 active abilities: Archer, Cannon, Ballista, and Spell. The first 3 of those are towers, and when a tower is loaded and ready to fire, the appropriate counter around your cursor will increase. You can then hit the WASD keys to perform the respective attack. Building more towers increases your rate of attack, and gathering runes increases the effectiveness of each attack, as well as adding neat little bonuses like additional projectiles per attack, a vortex created on impact, and other fun things. The spell is determined by your selected wizard, although from my understanding you aren't selecting a different wizard being, you're selecting a different wizard ability. But who am I to say what's happening? There are 4 possible spells: Ice, which slows in a zone, Fire, which burns in a zone, Poison, which seems to do the same thing as Fire but for more damage. I'm expecting that different enemies are weak to Fire and Poison, but this isn't very clear, and Vortex, which pulls the enemies to the center for a very short time and combos well with planned attack. There are lots of different enemies with various movement patterns. Eventually you'll encounter troop transports and portals and digging rigs that produce units closer to your control zone. There are dragons and magic guys and giant blue slimes and a whole lot of chaos caused by these. Now that you understand the game at its core, I'll be breaking my feedback into 4 parts: what I like and why, the weakest areas, bugs/issues, and improvement suggestions. So let's jump into the first one. What I like and why. The Tetris walls are great. They not only force you to make strategic choices about where to put walls based on what's given, but if you really need a certain wall finished, they can absolutely cause chaos. When you're watching a missile come in and you keep getting single squares, you feel real pressure. And this helps add into that very arcadey feel of it. The different unit types feel well balanced, and when you learn how to counter singles and groups of units, you can really cut down on the early game pressure and focus on long-term strategy. I am hoping that some of the more simple units change out as you enter different sections of the world map, but that the balance is still there, keeping the early game sections of each level from dragging as the starting units switch up every 3 levels. If all of them start with the same couple of units, just with, as we see early on, some digging rigs in places or some troop transports, it'd get a little stale. So I hope the snow sections and whatever comes later do have their own starter units. I wasn't a fan of the WASD actions at first, and I still tend to click for the archers, but I've come to really appreciate it. This is a control scheme that only works because there's no camera movement, but we'll talk about that in the next section. The enemy movement variation feels really good. I like that they'll sometimes meander or take different paths around natural obstacles. This grants the player a temporary reprieve to focus on another area of incoming enemies when they learn to identify the routes and notice enemy decisions, and it really forces you to use your brain around the entire map, which is both good and bad, and you'll see me talk about this in a little bit. Each tower has a great variety of utility, and it really doesn't cost much to test out on new enemy types. So while you understand all the towers fairly quickly, and they're never going to change outside of the runes you pick for them, the new enemies that come in do force you to sometimes stray away from making an attack that you know will work, to test something out that you think will work pretty well, and maybe you're right. So the weakest areas. The 3 tower plus spell set of actions is smooth and simple to grasp, but that tied to the control scheme does immediately signal to the player that this is really all they get. For an arcadey game, that's great, and I don't think this needs to change, but it's good to keep in mind that the knowledge that they have all the mechanics they will get can drive some players to say, "I've experienced everything," and stop playing even just a few levels in. Enemy visibility isn't great, and in the early levels I chalked this up to a design choice of wanting the enemies to feel like they belong in this wilderness, but as more enemies emerge that are easier to see both because of their color and their size, I started to wonder if I was wrong in my original assumption or if these enemies that blend in were superseded by enemies that look cool as development progressed. This issue really starts to pop up as other enemies, which do stand out, appear in larger numbers. Not only are they more visible, they do more damage, and so my brain deprioritizes seeing these weaker enemies and they blur into the map entirely. On more than one occasion I thought I was holding back waves of strong enemies when actually these little goblin boys were approaching around the forest, invisible to the busy eye. Walls can feel quite weak as the game progresses, with even a single unit being able to disable a rune pretty easily. This is a balancing point, and for much of my playtime the walls felt right, but a suggestion I wanted to make is either add an additional constant rune slot in the world map that supports a single wall upgrade rune, or have each controlled garrison improve wall strength by a little bit. Sorry to make a request that expands scope, but I felt this was an important point. If players feel the need to double, triple, quadruple up their walls, they're going to focus less on building towers and capturing new runes, and more like they're held in once they get to a point where enemies are actually attacking the walls. So the escape menu has way too many buttons in this single column. This might seem like a small point, especially if you've never developed an interface, but players interpret menus primarily subconsciously, and this large column makes a player have to engage active perception, which can be an early drain on their energy to play the game. I'd recommend moving the options, world map, and how to play buttons to icons, maybe in the top left. Remove the main menu button from this entirely and add that back to the world screen, making this column only have 4 items: resume, world map, restart level, exit game. Exit game could also be moved to an icon, but that doesn't feel right to me. Any sort of icon you could use that would tell the player what it means would kind of stand out in context of your overall menu design here. The lack of a zoom, while understandable, does mean that many enemies are hard to differentiate at a glance, especially when they're shielded. Since WASD is already taken up, you could put this on the mouse and add 2 remappable keys for zooming all the way out and all the way in. When building mode is activated, quickly pan to the garrison. I'd suggest additional options to determine if the player wants to return to their selected zoom level and if they want to return to where they were looking when they return to combat mode. A third remappable keybind for moving the camera back to the garrison without entering combat mode would help round this all out. Again, I understand why there isn't a zoom in here already, but you've got some really good looking sprites here, and the only way to appreciate them is to enter building mode when they're close to the garrison. The lack of any clear visual indicator for the reload time of towers is extremely annoying and hurts short-term planning. You could have the little symbol on the cursor fill up in color to display the timer, or have the tower damage panel be present all the time and display it there. Additional point, why isn't the tower damage panel present outside of the escape menu? I get that it's not huge in terms of knowing what does what, but it is a pretty important stat to keep track of, and it does seem like it should be more prominent. So here are some bugs/issues I found. Not too many, but a couple. These little guys seem to just sit there and smack nothing, which isn't a problem until you reach the end of the level and the game doesn't end. Combine this with the difficulty of being able to spot enemies, and you can waste a minute or two looking for the tiniest movement before you can actually move on to playing more of the game. There's already been a point made about this on the Steam community page, but I wanted to point it out here too for visibility and so that anyone going to play the game will know that if they're stuck at the end of a level, look around. When the screen shakes to initialize the start of the first wave, the mouse moves between placeable spots if you're still on the archer. Because the first archer might not be placed, this shake could cause players to put their archer where they didn't want it. This is a very small thing, but I don't think there's any way to move towers, and so this could hurt if they had a plan in mind. It isn't always perfectly clear why an enclosure is not working. If you look at this example, I'm trying to close off this outer area of this rune, thinking that maybe there's a bug going on and I can't actually close this because the game thinks certain squares need to be filled. But really the issue is that I have broken inner enclosures leading to the outer world, and it's hard to pinpoint those, especially when things are flying across and blocking visibility, and some sort of bright point, like the red markers you already use, updating as I place new walls, would definitely help the player in the heat of battle see what needs to be fixed so that they can repair everything, get their runes back, and fight things off. Here are some improvement suggestions. First, I wanted to make a mention of difficulty scaling for additional challenge, with the caveat that I don't know how the difficulty feels later in the game. I'd recommend additional New Game Plus difficulty modes where you carry your runes over, but two things make the game harder. One, the slow time effect of building mode should be reduced, maxing out at there being no slowdown at all. This really pushes people to think tactically and to time their advancements of their zones properly. Now, this could hurt when there is a wall destroyed, but I think a lot of players would like this change as they get better and better at the game. Secondly, ground enemy movement speed should increase, which will raise the difficulty ceiling by requiring better prediction for shots, especially on the ballista, less so for the archer, and the mortar. I think a lot of people tend to save it for groups, and so that's a bit easier to plan for, as well as for static objects, but especially the ballista. It already has a fair difficulty ceiling to it where you do have to predict where enemies are going, especially at the further ranges, but something like this is a step away from the make enemies have more health difficulty type and more towards the how can we reduce the assistance in our game so that you have to try harder. Aside from that, I actually only have one category of improvements, though it does have two names. Accessibility/visibility. I'd like to clarify that I am certified in two things. In software development, I am a certified accessibility expert. In game development, I am a certified terrible artist. This combo means I have a pretty good idea of how to make even the worst eyesight be able to interpret a terrible looking screen, which yours is not. Here's a mix of accessibility issues and accessibility options. The ability counters are just black text on a variety of colored background, making them difficult to read at a glance on a lot of the forest region. Your options here are a larger font, the classic white text with black border, or expand the crosshair at the 4 points and bring the text in a bit to create a constant background for them. There's no clear way right now to know which tower is going to shoot, and this doesn't hinder gameplay too often, but I have a suggestion. Add an option to turn on targeting lines for the archer and ballista that will point at the cursor from the turret that will fire, so I can choose to add a little more visual clutter to the screen in exchange for a better understanding of my plan. This little blur trail effect on these guys is pretty cool, but for the first couple hours I thought they were weird sandwich meat blobs. It was only when I got really close to the screen that I noticed they had this effect. Some extra motion effect on the blurring, or a larger model size, or a zoom function like we talked about earlier would definitely help them stand out a bit more and not look so weird and jagged while they move across. Overall, this is a high quality game with a clear knowledge of what it is and isn't. It's a game I want to see succeed as it takes some risks in a genre where most games play it safe. There's lots of functionality you could add, but at its core, half-human games have created an addictively fun game that just needs a bit of polish, an enemy compendium, and a proper tutorial. You can play the demo on Steam right now, and I highly suggest that you do, as well as sharing it with your friends and on social media. Wishlist the full game on Steam if you like it to increase their visibility both on Steam and to investors, and use the Steam community page or social media to give your own feedback. Remember that indie developers are very open to understanding what works and what doesn't work in their game, as they are much more likely to take risks than larger studios. So when they take a risk like this, give them feedback on it. If you like something, if you don't like something, everything you can tell them helps, but just remember that constructive feedback is much better than I don't like this or I do like this, because that's much harder to work on. If you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe, and if you've played the game, leave a comment down below about how you feel about it. I've got a lot of demos to cover still, and a lot of indie games that are already published, so stick around in the future for more episodes of Fed Back, where I chew up indie games and feed them right back to you. Bye!